In 1921, an American city was attacked from the inside, not by a foreign enemy, not during a war overseas, but by its own citizens, on its own soil. In less than 24 hours, a thriving black community was burned to the ground. Homes were destroyed, businesses were looted, lives were taken, and then it was erased. For decades, what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma was barely mentioned. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't written into history books. Survivors were told to stay silent. This wasn't a riot. It wasn't chaos. It was an organized act of racial violence, carried out in broad daylight and followed by a deliberate cover-up. An entire black city was destroyed, not because it was failing, but because it was thriving. To understand why Greenwood became a target as Tahrir, you first have to understand what it was. Because before the fire, before the mobs, before the silence, Greenwood stood as one of the most successful black communities in America. This is the story of Greenwood. Before it was burned, before Greenwood became a crime scene, it was a community. Located in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District was home to thousands of black residents in the early 1900s. At a time when segregation limited opportunity, Greenwood created its own. Black doctors treated black patients. Black lawyers defended black clients. Black teachers educated black children. Greenwood had grocery stores, clothing shops, hotels, restaurants, newspapers, theaters, and banks, all owned and operated by black entrepreneurs. Money circulated within the community. Families built businesses. Children grew up seeing success that looked like them. It was so prosperous that it earned a nickname, Black Wall Street. Greenwood wasn't hidden. It wasn't secret. It stood as visible proof that black Americans could build wealth, stability, and independence, even under the weight of Jim Crow laws. Churches filled every weekend. Streets were busy. Neighbors knew one another. Greenwood was more than economics. It was dignity. But in a deeply segregated America, prosperity did not go unnoticed. Greenwood's success unsettled the social order. It challenged the belief that black advancement had limits. And in a society built on racial hierarchy, that kind of success was seen as a threat. What Greenwood represented, independence, pride, and power, would soon make it a target. Because before Greenwood was destroyed, resentment had already taken root. In 1921, America was deeply divided along racial lines. Segregation was law. White supremacy was enforced, not just socially, but economically. Black success was supposed to exist within boundaries. Quiet, limited, dependent. Greenwood broke those expectations. Its residents owned land. They owned businesses. They employed one another. They kept their wealth inside their community. For many white residents of Tulsa, Greenwood was not admired. It was resented. Newspapers portrayed black prosperity as arrogance. Rumors spread that Greenwood residents were forgetting their place. World War I had just ended. Black veterans returned home wearing uniforms, expecting the freedoms they had fought for overseas. Instead, they were met with hostility. Across the country, racial violence was increasing. Lynchings were common. White mobs acted with little fear of consequence. Tulsa was not immune. Beneath the surface of Greenwood's success, resentment was building. Fear mixed with jealousy. Prosperity became provocation. Greenwood did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it stood in defiance of a system that demanded submission. And all it took to ignite that resentment was an accusation. That accusation would come from a place no one expected. A small elevator on a quiet morning in Tulsa. On the morning of May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered an office building in downtown Tulsa. He used the elevator, the only one available to black residents, operated by a 17-year-old white elevator attendant named Sarah Page. What happened inside that elevator lasted only moments. No one else was present. Shortly after, Sarah Page was heard screaming. Dick Rowland ran. Within hours, rumors began to spread. By the next day, Tulsa newspapers published headlines suggesting an assault, claims that were never proven. There was no physical evidence, no medical report confirming an attack, no formal charge filed for assault. Dick Rowland was arrested, not for violence, but for his own protection. In Tulsa in 1921, that phrase carried a dangerous meaning. The accusation did not need to be verified. It only needed to be believed, and belief spread faster than truth. White residents gathered outside the courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held. Armed, angry, talk of a lynching filled the air. For Greenwood's residents, the threat was unmistakable. They had seen this pattern before, an accusation, a crowd, a life taken, and so members of Greenwood prepared to intervene, not to incite violence, but to prevent it. What followed was not a misunderstanding. It was the moment when fear, resentment, and rumor collided, and Tulsa crossed a line it could never undo. By the evening of May 31st, 1921, the streets of Tulsa were tense. Outside the county courthouse, a white mob had gathered. They were armed. They were demanding Dick Rowland. Inside Greenwood, the danger was clear. Black residents understood what an accusation like this usually led to. They had seen it before, in towns across America, where mobs acted first and the law looked away. A group of black men, many of them World War I veterans, decided to intervene. They went to the courthouse not to start a fight, but to stop a lynching. They were armed for one reason: survival. They offered their assistance to the authorities. They were told to leave. As they turned to go, a white man tried to disarm one of the veterans. A struggle followed. A shot rang out. That single moment shattered any chance of restraint. Gunfire erupted. Panic spread. The crowd scattered. Within minutes, rumors swept through Tulsa that black residents were uprising, that Greenwood was attacking the city. None of it was true, but the lie was enough. White residents armed themselves. Deputies began deputizing civilians, handing out badges and weapons. Law enforcement did not move to protect Greenwood. They moved to contain it. By nightfall, Tulsa was at war with one of its own communities. What followed was not spontaneous violence. It was systematic destruction. And Greenwood was about to be consumed. As night turned into early morning on June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was surrounded. Armed white mobs moved toward the district from multiple directions. They came on foot. They came by car. And they came with purpose. Homes were set on fire. Businesses were looted. Anything of value was taken before buildings were burned to the ground. Greenwood's streets, once filled with commerce and community, became corridors of smoke and flame. Residents ran for their lives. Families fled with whatever they could carry. Many had nowhere to go. Those who tried to defend their homes were outnumbered, overwhelmed. Witnesses later reported something even more disturbing. Airplanes flew overhead. From the sky, incendiary materials were dropped, accelerating the fires below. The destruction was no longer contained. It was deliberate. This was not a riot. It was not chaos. It was an assault on a community. By mid-morning, Greenwood was unrecognizable. More than 35 city blocks were destroyed. Over 1,000 homes were burned. Schools, churches, hospitals, and businesses were reduced to ashes. The wealth Greenwood had built over decades disappeared in hours. Fire departments did not intervene. Police did not stop the mobs. In many cases, they stood aside. In others, they participated. Greenwood burned while the rest of Tulsa watched. By the time the smoke cleared, an entire black city had been erased from the map. But the destruction did not end with fire. What followed was another crime, quieter and just as devastating: When the fires finally began to die down, Greenwood was no longer a neighborhood. It was a ruin. Bodies lay in the streets. Others were buried hastily or never accounted for at all. The exact number of those killed has never been fully known. Official reports listed only a few dozen deaths. Survivors and historians believe the true number was far higher, possibly hundreds. But even in death, Greenwood's residents were denied dignity. Instead of receiving aid, black survivors were rounded up. Thousands were arrested, not for crimes, but for existing. Men, women, and children were forced into detention centers. They were held under armed guard, released only if a white employer vouched for them. The people who had been attacked were treated as criminals. Families searched for loved ones among the ruins. Many never found them. Homes were gone. Businesses were gone. Entire lives had been wiped out overnight. Those who survived were displaced, sleeping in tents, churches, and makeshift shelters. Winter would come soon, help would not. Insurance companies refused to pay claims. They cited riot clauses, even though Greenwood had been invaded, not rioting. Without compensation, rebuilding was nearly impossible. Greenwood's residents were expected to start over with nothing. The physical destruction was complete, but the damage went deeper. Trauma spread through generations. Stories went untold, grief went unacknowledged, and the city of Tulsa began doing something else entirely. It began to forget. Because once the bodies were buried and the ruins cleared, the silence began, and silence would become the final weapon. After Greenwood was destroyed, there were no mass arrests of those responsible, no trials, no convictions. The people who burned homes, looted businesses, and killed residents returned to their lives without consequence. City officials framed what happened as a riot, a word that shifted blame onto the very people who had been attacked. Newspapers quietly removed the most inflammatory articles from their archives. Some issues disappeared entirely. Police records were incomplete. Court documents went missing. Testimonies were ignored. What could not be justified was buried. Survivors were discouraged from speaking. Some were threatened. Others were told it was better to move on. For decades, Tulsa did not acknowledge what had happened. Schools did not teach it. Public officials did not discuss it. An entire generation grew up unaware that a black city once stood and that it had been destroyed by racial violence. Greenwood wasn't just burned, it was erased from memory. The silence was not accidental, it was deliberate, because remembering Greenwood meant confronting responsibility. And responsibility was something the city refused to claim, but even silence has limits because stories survive in families, in whispered memories, and in the refusal to forget. For decades after the destruction of Greenwood, silence became policy. Survivors carried their stories quietly. Many were children in 1921, forced to grow up with memories no one wanted to hear. Some spoke only in private. Others never spoke at all. The trauma did not disappear. It was passed down through fear, caution, and unanswered questions. Greenwood's loss was not only physical, it was economic. Generations of black families were stripped of homes, businesses, and wealth that could have been inherited. The opportunity to build lasting stability was destroyed. Meanwhile, the city of Tulsa prospered. Streets were rebuilt, new developments rose, but Greenwood's absence remained. For most of the 20th century, the Tulsa Race Massacre was not part of official history. It existed only in the memories of those who lived through it. No reparations were paid, no justice was delivered. The message was clear. Some crimes were not meant to be remembered, but memory has a way of resurfacing. Because as the century came to an end, the silence finally began to crack. By the late 1990s, the silence surrounding Greenwood could no longer hold. Survivors were aging. Their stories were at risk of being lost forever. Pressure began to build. From historians, journalists, and descendants who refused to let the truth remain buried. In 1997, the state of Oklahoma authorized an official investigation into the events of 1921. For the first time, what survivors had been saying for decades was taken seriously. The commission confirmed what Greenwood residents had always known. The violence was widespread, it was organized, and it was racially motivated. The report acknowledged the role of local authorities, not as protectors, but as participants and enablers. Mass graves were investigated. Public discussions began. The word massacre replaced riot. Greenwood was slowly restored to public memory. But acknowledgement came without repair. Survivors were not compensated. Families received no restitution for stolen land and destroyed businesses. Recognition, it seemed, had limits. Still, remembrance mattered. It meant the truth had survived, and it meant Greenwood could no longer be denied. But remembering the past is not the same as reckoning with it. And the question remained, what does Greenwood mean today? Greenwood is not just a story from the past. It is a warning. The destruction of Black Wall Street was not only an act of violence, it was an act of economic erasure. Generations of wealth were lost in a single night. Opportunities that could have shaped families for decades were burned to the ground. The effects did not end in 1921. They carried forward into housing disparities, into economic inequality, into communities forced to rebuild without support. Greenwood shows what happens when Black success is treated as a threat instead of a contribution. It shows how quickly prosperity can be taken when the system decides it does not belong to you. The massacre also exposes a deeper truth. Violence is only one part of injustice. Silence is the other. What happened in Tulsa was not only the burning of a city, it was the decision to pretend it never existed. And that decision allowed the damage to last for generations. Greenwood matters today because history repeats itself when it is ignored. And when the truth is finally spoken, it leaves one final question. What does justice look like when it comes a century too late? Greenwood was not destroyed by accident. It was destroyed by fear. Fear of Black independence, fear of Black prosperity, fear of what Greenwood represented. The violence that swept through Tulsa in 1921 ended lives, but the silence that followed prolonged the damage. For decades, survivors carried the weight alone. Their losses were denied. Their voices ignored. Brief pause. History did not forget Greenwood by chance. It forgot because forgetting was easier than facing responsibility. But truth does not disappear. It waits. It waits in families who remember. In communities that rebuild. In stories that refuse to stay buried. The Tulsa Race Massacre was not a riot. It was a crime of hate. And the silence that followed was part of the crime. Remember Greenwood. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Remember the Ones History Tried to Erase.